This podcast is produced by the Center for Deployment Psychology at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. The views expressed are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. In addition, references to any specific companies, products, processes, or services does not necessarily constitute or imply endorsement by the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Welcome to CDP's podcast, Practical for Your Practice,
where we give you actionable intel to support what you do.
One colleague to another. Welcome to Practical for Your Practice. I am Dr. Jenna Ermold, and as always, I am joined by my colleagues, Drs. Kevin Holloway and Andrew Santinello. Want to say hi, guys?
Hey, everybody.
Hello. Hey, how's it going?
All right. And today we are very excited to have our colleague and somebody that we have definitely been excited to have on this podcast for a long time, Dr. Peter Tuerk. So welcome, Peter. We're excited to have this conversation with you. You want to start by just sharing a little bit about your background, who you are, and then we'll launch into talking about integration of technology into clinical work.
So thanks, Jenna, for having me. I've also been very much looking forward to our conversation today. For many years, my work's focused on PTSD and evidence-based treatments within the VA. For the last few years, I've moved to the University of Virginia, where I'm still focusing on evidence-based treatments in community outpatient settings. Sit on an NIH technology transfer committees to review the R41 through 44 series quite often. So I have a ringside seat for the new apps coming out in the mental health field, which is a lot of fun. And I also work with mental health companies, specifically Virtually Better in Atlanta, Georgia, to develop apps for mental health. I'm really excited to talk about my foibles and the things that I think are interesting and exciting coming down the pike.
Awesome. Thank you for that background. And, you know, I think it's always interesting to hear how you got into this sort of slice of our field, because you've sort of been on the forefront of how do we use technology to enhance clinical care, to make it more available to different populations. Like, what made you decide you wanted to move into that?
So I think that for me, it all started back in 2009 when we were using telehealth in the VA to just to do patchwork for psychiatrists when they were unable to attend or they were absent from their clinic. We would patch in a prescriber to our community-based outreach clinics that they could get their prescriptions done. And then there was this veteran who had PTSD, and everybody was really pulling for him in his own community, in his CBOC, as we say in the VA world, the community-based outreach center, to get prolonged exposure. And so we decided to give it a shot over telehealth, and it worked really well. It certainly turned his life around and really opened my eyes up to the wonders of telehealth. And then so I guess facing some amount of outrage that we would do exposure therapy over telehealth back then, we decided as a group, myself, Rana Chierno at the VA at the time, to lean into the telehealth issue and study it. And the more we studied it, the more we found that the effect sizes were really good. And so we became sort of advocates for this in the field. And I think that was my first entry into technology in the mental health way. Now everybody's very familiar with telehealth, and that's fantastic. It's one of the few positives of COVID, obviously. But from there, I kind of got interested in virtual reality for exposure therapies, and then app development. Sort of just happened organically over time.
It's interesting to hear you kind of describe your entry into it. And I think I hear that similar story kind of between the interface of technology and medical care, but specifically in the mental health field. There's a problem when we can't do it the way we normally would. So I guess we'll try this other way. And then even after it seems to be helpful, why don't we do this more often? There's resistance to it. Well, it's not good enough. And, we just did this to plug a hole. And the work you're doing is really proactive in a lot of ways, kind of looking ahead, not just trying to solve a problem that just came up organically, but how can we take this technology forward and offer maybe some new things that we couldn't offer before?
Well, thanks for saying that, Andy. I mean, I think that we are all trying to solve problems and look a little bit farther down the road. Having touched a hot stove so many times with dissemination, in non-technology settings. When we throw technology into the EBT mix, we all have to be really aware that this is now another living, breathing organism, if you will, at the table that we need to think about when we think about dissemination. And a lot of times we think of technology as a doorway to help dissemination, but if you don't really plan for it and use your scientific method, it's just another complicating factor, one more reason why people wouldn't do evidence-based treatment. So I think that I'm really on board with that sentiment of sort of trying to anticipate what the problems will be.
So, that's a topic that's really interesting to me as well. So, before being at CDP, I was at T2 and we did some work with Barbara Rothbaum and Virtually Better and trying to disseminate virtual reality exposure therapy for PTSD in particular. And that was always a question on my mind when we would do these training workshops is, it's not just training PE, for example, and then throwing a computer on it. There was intentional focused training on, using the computer system and how do we make that work? And what are the changes or the alterations to the protocol? And the question always came up during those workshops and even in my own thinking about it later is we've got a lot of studies that support using prolonged exposure therapy in this particular instance. And we hopefully will have some studies supporting using virtual reality therapy, as an adjustment or a version perhaps of PE. The question always has been on my mind, okay, what are we testing? Are we testing exposure via virtual reality? Are we testing this particular software package? Are we testing the implementation? And there's all those complicating questions that come in. So it's always interesting to me to think through those pieces as well.
Yeah, I think that's the problem, right? So if we look in just the last 5 years, we'll see over 40 reviews of mental health technology, right, published out there. And so just because one researcher got one widget to work with one population doesn't mean that that's going to disseminate or work with another population, because it's really all about the usability, Kevin, right? You're talking about how usable is one solution from the other. And I think that's our job, is to sort of design proof of concept and then really pivot to usability and dissemination.
And even thinking about, what are those, critical elements that are making this work if we find that it's working in a particular situation? Because again, oftentimes I'll read articles that are talking about demonstrating the usability or the effectiveness or efficacy of this particular technology solution. And then it seems to just almost automatically generalize then to using virtual reality for all things or using apps for all things. And it's like, well, no, you only tested this one solution. So yeah. But so much really great work to do, right?
There is. And I feel like that we're slowing science down, I think, by focusing on evidence-based treatment as a brand, right? So, consider PE or even behavioral activation or something maybe more complex like ACT, right? A lot of folks want to have their branded mobile application solution that matches their EBT. And that makes sense. It's part of, human nature to want to have your own little thing. But what I think it's done is it's really spread to a lot of false assumptions that we make in general about how best apps can serve our clients and our fellow colleagues serving clients. I think one of the big assumptions that is false is that new applications are needed for each individual new EBT, right? Another related false assumption is that EBTs are best served by one and only one app product, and that, EBT technologies should include all components of an EBT, right? So I think that's really slowing us down, and we're not being able to kind of use the technologies piecemeal to piece together behavioral solutions. If I can, I can highlight a story that would bring this to light a little bit. If you can imagine. If you can imagine like a branded mobile application technology that's attached to a specific EBT, and it doesn't matter what it is. Let's say it's for self-tracking of specific behaviors, okay? The target behaviors, let's say, occur at multiple times during the course of the day and potentially at random, unpredictable times, as behavior does. So mobile technology might be a really good, useful tool, right? It's a simple, elegant solution with a fairly high likelihood of success if you're just tracking specific behaviors. But our branded solutions will rarely stop there. So, doing the planning process, the EBT team that's eager to take advantage of all the things the mobile platform has to offer might be tempted to load the psychoeducation treatment materials onto the mobile app and the user interface. They might decide to enter in a behavioral hierarchy, right? And then maybe doing the development, the PI gets this idea to put in like prompts, like motivational prompts, like you can do it, or things like that. That sounds like a really good idea to the team. And then somebody else maybe along the line says, we should put in emergency numbers in case somebody's feeling suicidal, right? And so in this example, the whole treatment protocol and then additional materials ends up being loaded onto the mobile application, solving a lot of problems that didn't really exist. There was no necessary identified need to have the psychoeducation materials always available. Like clinicians rarely think, if only my client had constant access to my psychoeducation materials, this case would have gone better, right? In this example, there is no preliminary user data to test the rationale or, the benefits or the potential frustrations of constructing and arranging a behavioral hierarchy on a 2x3-inch mobile screen. There was no data to inform the urgency or effectiveness or unintended consequences, really, of conveying emergency numbers in the context that was originally just designed to track behaviors. The motivational messaging that sounds like a really good idea in, when you actually carry that out into implementation, the prompts to track the behaviors and the motivational messages might take an extra 3 seconds to read and an extra click to actually get through. So you're actually maybe making it harder for people to track the behaviors that you wanted them to track to begin with. So the result is a solution that has this huge footprint, and it could have had this very elegant solution, but because there's this gravity to make it a branded solution tied to the whole EBT, it's just a lot more to bug test, to beta test, to test for usability, and it's a lot more to test for clinical efficacy as well. What's working, what's not working, we don't know. And all that sort of makes for very heavy mobile applications, and anybody that's used to using mental health mobile applications, has had this experience. They seem like heavy apps often. And what we're looking for, I think, are lighter apps, more usable apps. And, we don't want providers to feel like they have to use an app tied to a specific treatment if they're trying to do something behavioral. All EBTs share very common things: tracking behaviors, encouraging meta awareness. And there's all kinds of apps we can use for this. They're not necessarily mental health apps. Calendar, right, is a great app to use. Outlook reminders, things like that I think are underutilized because people are looking for the EBT whole source solution.
That's a really great point too, because as I think about some apps that I've come across, for example, and there are so many apps out there, and some of them are really fantastic, and some of them are less fantastic, and I'm just thinking theoretically speaking, but the ones that confuse me the most are the apps that almost replicate the device itself, right? Like, so an app perhaps that, where a client can collect photographs that remind them of good things or, reasons to stay engaged in treatment. And then you can put in music here, where you can go and collect this music. And then, again, like you said, contact numbers for emergency or for therapists or for, supportive others. And I wonder, like, did we just recreate the phone in this app, right?
In a less usable, less intuitive way, right?
Right.
It's such an interesting, way of thinking about it, because we talk so much about the science of evidence-based, or developing evidence-based psychotherapies and disseminating them. And of course, that's important. But you use that word usability a bunch. Mm-hmm. And from the end user client side of it, what have you kind of seen? What do you suggest? What do you think is most important when it comes to actually getting a client to then pick up the app and use it to support therapy? What do you think could be useful as, apps continue to develop in the future?
Yeah, I think that, Andy, it goes back to making sure that what you're suggesting fits into their life, right? And it is usable. If we look at how we use apps, how any individual uses apps, we use them a lot during the course of the day in tiny little increments, right? So we're interfacing with an app for maybe 10 to 15 seconds at a time, maybe 2 minutes, right? So we're not interfacing with an app for a 60-minute session, right? And so the more that we can tack towards apps that don't try to replicate what we do in the real world in the digital space, but actually use the ecologically valid digital context, the better off we'll be. So, I think that's, we call that a skewmorph, right? When something replicates something in the physical world unnecessarily in the app world. And so the classic example of a skewmorph is like maybe a little icon of a phone, of an old phone that has a handheld, right? That doesn't exist in the real world anymore. Or an alarm clock app that has a picture of an alarm clock. Those are very harmless skewmorphs. But when it comes to mental health implementation, if we're stuck in this idea that the apps are sessions, right, or are specific components of a treatment, we're not really taking advantage of how people use digital technologies. We need to be lighter. We need to be thinking, less content more often, I think. And so to kind of pivot back to your question, I would say choosing apps that you test out as a hypothesis. Maybe this app will be good. You try it for a week, I'll try it for a week, and then we'll come together and we'll see what we think. And maybe we'll pivot to something else. Maybe we'll go back to pen and paper. We have to be thinking, what's going to get this to work for our client. The other thing that I think is worth fighting for, and is directly related to your question, Andy, is we all have to continue the I guess the word is advocacy, right, against institutions that want to overinterpret HIPAA and data security, right? So what we know is people like to text. We know that. And you might even text your primary care provider because there's less hangups in the medical field than we have in psychology. And it is for those of you in private practice, or maybe who are bending the rules in institutions that text their clients, how easy and how useful this is, how you can get people to engage with treatment, less dropouts, more homework compliance, more connectivity, more therapeutic alliance, right? Just simply by texting. But that becomes really, really difficult if you have an ISO, information security officer, that won't allow texting. And so I think that, I'm going on and on about the simple question, but I think that we want to go with what works, what's simple. We want to be able to tack away from the solutions that aren't working for us. And we want to be able to keep up the good fight. And so that we can allow our clients the benefit and the common courtesy of using technologies to the extent that they use them in the rest of their lives.
One of the keys of what you said, at least for me, was we have to start thinking about the use of technology from the perspective of what technologies are useful versus from the perspective of mental health providers and how we do things. I love that term skewmorph. I'm going to use that constantly now.
Gee, thanks, Peter.
Yeah, sure, no problem. It's same thing happened to me, Andy. When I saw that word was out there and it's developed a long time ago, I use it constantly now too.
Well, and it reminded me a lot of, some of the training, actually a lot of the training that we've done for years at CDP has been virtual more recently through Zoom. And Kevin, before I came to CDP, along with Jenna, developed training through Second Life. And one of the, pieces of pushback, I think, and you guys let me know if this is accurate, that we've received is it's not the same as in-person training. It's not as good as in-person training. We have to make sure we're replicating stuff online exactly the way it is in person, or else it's not as good, which, it's sort of that idea of like, we need to skewmorph things online to be the same. And that ignores some of the unique affordances of technology that we could really leverage and maybe do something slightly different or better, not to replace, an in-person therapy session or an in-person training session, but to get at another piece of human behavior in a different way that could be useful.
I think that's the comparison absolutely. That drives me nuts, right? Is the idea that it's got to be like what we're used to, right? It's got to be like what we're familiar with, or as good as or better than, right? And what's funny is that to me, that's not the comparison that's relevant. We'll have folks say, well, you need to do training in person because that's better. You get better outcomes. Number one, we haven't actually seen that. We've seen that outcomes are at least as good and sometimes even better online. And number two, even if it wasn't as good, the comparison of, in-person versus online isn't necessarily the most relevant. The comparison is how much are they learning compared to not learning at all? because that's actually the alternative for a lot of people who are learning online. And similarly for therapy, right? We've seen a lot of this in the last year and a half. The comparison of online therapy to in-person therapy, we really don't see a big difference. But even if there was a bit of a difference, the real relevant comparison is people getting therapy online versus not at all, or some kind of substandard version of that. So on the one hand, I think, the relevant comparisons is an important one, but also then too, let's not get limited by what we've always done. We doing it this way just because we've done it that way doesn't hold up when we start exploring these alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And we've talked about that point a lot. What's the right comparison group for this? And especially when it comes to training, there's going to be people out there that have the fire in their belly to learn new things and to fight for their clients and to stay flexible. And there's going to be people that it's just not their bag, right? They went to school, they learned their thing. And that's just human nature. And so I think if we point to the group that's doing the training because they need their CEs or their boss told them they had to, and we say, okay, this online format or this mobile app-based learning maybe is not working, and that's why. Well, that's not really true, because that's probably, we know when we do trainings that a certain amount of folks are just sitting there anyway, and it's still good for them to be exposed for stuff. But when I think about doing a 40-person training for an evidence-based treatment, literally, this is what I think, and it's just anecdotal. If I can get 2 or 3 people from that training to actually change the way they do things and become an advocate for that treatment, I feel like it's a success, and I feel like it's worth it. Because I mean, if you can get to 2 or 3 providers, I mean, that's hundreds and hundreds of families and clients and patients over the course of a career. So it doesn't faze me at all to do a week-long training for 40 people just to change 2 or 3 providers' minds and ideas.
Strongly agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. One of the cool things that you just speaking kind of made me think of is, imagine a training that was actually supposed to be deployed as you were learning the therapy with a client, right? So it's an asynchronous training that you pivot to right before every session, and maybe even during the session, and you work on the materials with the client together even. So the client's learning along with the therapist, and they've got the support that's right there. I think that would be a really cool model to explore and try out, especially because we know that it's the post-training supervision and implementation that stops people, even well-intended people, from carrying forward with their training and changing their behaviors. So I'm really excited about asynchronous technologies. I'm really excited about crowdsourcing, or in this sense, provider sourcing. And so many of you have heard me talk about OCGo, which is a project that we've been working on with our partners at University of LA and UCLA, I should say. And so for the last 5 years, we've been doing this randomized trial for childhood OCD, looking at this app where providers are crowdsourcing different exposure ideas for OCD and different psychoeducation materials that they can go online and they can say, oh, I like this one, I'm going to assign it to my client, and they push it to their client's cell phone right then and there. And so it's a cross between asynchronous crowdsourcing and asynchronous telehealth. So you can push a behavioral assignment to somebody's cell phone, and they can do their exposure right there along with their cell phone, whether it's in a restaurant or in a bathroom or wherever. And what gets shared is actually that digital template, no PHI. And it's a really fun platform for people to share ideas. And I think decentralizing this, unbranding things, and putting the power in providers to share what works is really exciting for me. And so, if anybody wanted to try it, it's still under development, but they're free accounts for providers. You can go to oc-go.org and make your own account. And, there's still it's not like a Disney level app, right? Because we developed it with NIH funding, but it's very self-evident, and you'll figure out ways to use it. And it's HIPAA compatible. You can use it with clients. There's still some glitches we're working out, but my hope is that folks will go on and at least see what's out there. They can search the library for different symptoms or search terms. And mostly it's for OCD right now, but there's some PTSD stuff on there as well.
So
That's great.
Go ahead. I'm
Peter.
sorry.
Oh, that's okay. And I was going to say, we will make sure to put some of those links in the show notes too, so folks can have that at the ready. And one of the things that we always do in this podcast, because it's called Practical for Your Practice, right? We want people to walk away with actionable intel, things that they can actually take forward and apply. So if you were to, again, we've got lots of different providers who are out there, some in community mental health, some in VA, some DOD. And if you were to kind of give a couple pieces of actionable intel, how can these providers most successfully integrate technology into their practice, app use into their practice? What few pieces of advice or actionable intel would you want to share with those folks?
So I think that you could start by using the apps that your client already has, right? So being interested, what apps do you, instead of coming with a solution, right? Say, what apps do you often use on your phone? And that'll give you a flavor for if they use apps, what apps they use. I think Kevin said earlier, the use of the camera, everybody uses their camera. So that's a really nice place to start. Doing your exposure this week, I want you to go take a picture of the Walmart you're going into. And then that can be a trophy that we can celebrate. It's also accountability in session, right? Did I do it? I'm going to be asking for this. You can ask people to do, you can make it fun. You can say, go take a picture of, the Texas Pete ingredients in the store, right? That that's sort of in the middle of the store. They can't get to it by staying in the periphery, as our PTSD clients like to do. So I think starting simple with what's on their phone, if you're not sure that somebody's going to adopt something, is very, very important. You can use maps, like I was saying, calendar reminders, things like that. But if we join with the client and understand how they use their phone to begin with, I think that that's the first assumption that we needed to get, and if we start there, then I think that's the recipe for success. There was a really cool paper. I mean, it's actually just face meltingly cool, by Brian Bunell. And it was back in 2013. It was just a case report. And he was treating selective mutism. And this case report outlined all the off-the-shelf free apps that he did to use that. And it worked really well. I'd never treated selective mutism in my practice before. I was supervising a case and I came across this paper and I just replicated what he did, and it was fantastic. So do you remember that old candle blowing app where there's a candle and you kind of blow it and
yes.
it quiver?
Yeah.
So it's a free app. He started with that to get the child to shape the behavior and then make guttural sounds. And it was just and then he graduated up to the different app after that. And it was a really well done, great example of everyday apps we can use to solve solutions without having to have a branded solution that maybe we have to pay for or get training for.
So a question I was going to ask before some of these tips, and maybe this goes along with tips too, is, there's so much out there. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of apps, and there's hundreds and hundreds of solutions. And as you were saying, some of them are very simple and elegant, and some of them are very complex. And crowdsourcing, I agree, just that seems like the way of the future. There's so much wisdom and knowledge and expertise out there. And not everything is created equal. Like there's some really good stuff and there's some really not terribly useful stuff. Do you have any tips for providers who are, kind of like sifting through this wealth of stuff available out there of how do you judge or determine, what is a useful application or technology or app versus those that are not so much?
Yeah, so I think that if we're just using off-the-shelf solutions, that will be self-evident. But if we're using a mental health solution, right, it would be great, for them to sort through and at least get the apps that have some evidence behind them. Somebody tested this in the real world. And we're not necessarily looking for clinical efficacy. We're looking for a process, right? So this company made this app, but then they threw it to providers. And those providers, whether or not it works clinically, they helped the app developers find the bugs, find the dead ends, make it a little bit more usable, things like that. So I think starting with apps that actually have some amount of evidence that there was a user base or there was stakeholders that were clinical that went into it, rather than just a company pumping out stuff and seeing what will stick. And the other thing is that ratings, right? So we all look at ratings. That's a really good indicator too. If something only has 3 or 4 ratings on it, and it's been out there for 3 or 4 years, well, maybe it's not the app for me, But I also think that it's not. It's almost like, Kevin, like the question, it comes from a perspective of how can I get started in using apps? And that's almost like a philosophical thing. Like, I want to get started using apps, when really, if we actually start with a problem that they're having, right, there'll be much more natural gravity for the clinician to want to solve that problem using a mental health technology or using an off-the-shelf technology. So I would say maybe just start with where you're having problems in your practice, and then taking a step back and saying, okay, how can technology help me solve this particular problem with this particular client? I think is a really great, useful place to start.
Love that, yeah.
I mean, we can look at, remember when PE Coach came out, right? And how great that when it first came out, everybody loved it for the recording, right? And people used it for the recording sessions because it solved that problem so elegantly. And way back in the day, people really weren't using it for the hierarchies and all the psychoeducation, and it got better and better as it went along. And now I think people are using it, more fully as it was intended. But that was a great example. Hundreds of clients and clinicians use that app just for the recording function. Yep. And so I would say, let's follow that example. Let's use what works in different apps. We don't have to take the whole solution, and just let's piece these things together.
But I think those are great. Like, those are great. Those 3 pieces of actionable intel, really. One is, how does your client use their phone? How does your client use their apps? Take the time to kind of, and I don't think a lot of people ask that or kind of get a sense of that. 2, do a little bit of homework and know how this app was developed, and make sure that you're checking the ratings and get some of that information. And you don't, giving permission to use parts of apps is fine. Like, you don't have to digest the entire app or use the entire app. The bits of it, maybe, what you want to use, and clients have permission to do that, and providers have permission to do that. And I think those are all great recommendations. Peter, we are going to be running out of time here, so we will wrap up for today. But again, very grateful for the time you spent with us, and really enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully we'll have you back again as OC-Go kind of continues to develop, and we wish you and your team tons of luck with that. I think all of us are really excited to test that out a lot more as well. And we hope to circle back with you sometime soon on some other front.
Yeah, maybe when COVID's over, we can do a skewmorph of the podcast, but have it be in person. And I told you I was not going to stop using it.
I would love that. I mean, I think that the work that the Center for Deployment Psychology has been doing and has been doing for years is great. And I feel really lucky that I'm considered a partner, and I want to continue to be a partner. It's just such a great organization. And I think that all of us that are in the field together, we have to find these ways to connect and learn from each other. So this is just a great forum for me. I had a lot of fun.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Practical for Your Practice. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Practical for Your Practice.
Please feel free to subscribe, rate, and join in on the conversation in the comments.
Until next time.